last time I said that I was going to start in 1932 and 1933 because if you just keep going backwards in history, you'll always find more stuff to look at and you'll never end up dealing with the topic that you've set for yourself. But 1932 and 33 were too ambitious, and in order to describe what happens in the interwar and post-war period, we're going to have to look earlier in the 19-teens and 1920s. So I apologize for that, but here we're going to do it anyway. This article is from 1944, and it's about a man, an attorney and former government employee, former U.S. federal government employee named Charles B. Brewer. He died, and the newspapers carried his obituary because in the 1920s he had caused a lot of problems for a lot of important people. The second highlighted section here, we're going to read that. It says, as a special assistant to the Attorney General during the Harding administration, Mr. Brewer conducted fraud investigations growing out of the last war. That was World War I. He also had been a special attorney for the Navy Department. And so no one had impugned Brewer's capacity as a federal employee or as an attorney. He continued to practice law until he died, and doing some research on him, I found the other cases he'd been involved in. What were his accusations? We're going to look at a newspaper from 1923, I think, from Colorado, I believe it was. Duplicate Liberty bonds in existence? It's the title of this article. Charles B. Brewer, Department of Justice attorney who investigated charges of duplication of government securities, brought the case into the open with the filing of sensational charges against the Treasury, and, despite denials by Secretary Mellon and other officials that his allegations contained merit, Representative Fiorello LaGuardia from New York began steps by introducing a resolution to force a congressional inquiry. Now, what ended up happening was that a bunch of the top people at the Treasury Department were fired. There was talk about them perhaps being rehired if the allegations were found to be without basis, but they were not rehired. Over the next, from let's say 1921 until 1927, these charges were in the newspapers, until about 1924, and then it fell out of the newspapers. But it was in court, going back and forth, because Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Brewer were impugning each other's character. And I think in 1924, the Secretary of the Treasury, or the Department of the Treasury, released a book or government publication saying that these charges were groundless. What Brewer was saying happened was that, the reason why we're talking about this issue is because World War I and the events a few years before that changed the structure of the American government and American economic life forever, absolutely forever. And we're still living with the changes that occurred then. The Federal Reserve was instituted in 1914 by an act of Congress, in which Congress gave up its rights, duties, and obligations to deal with the American money supply, gave that up to a cartel of mostly New York financiers. So that from that point onward, the United States doesn't really control its money supply or its interest rates, but rather this cartel of financiers controls those things. And there's an incredible amount of power which goes with those things, so it leaves the hands of any type of public control, any type of elections or referendum or anything like that. It's all just gone into the hands of private corporations, and particularly the most evil and destructive people at the heads of private corporations, which are these financiers. So in 1917, when the United States entered World War I, not out of humanitarian concerns, but because Carroll Quigley's Anglo-American transatlantic ruling class in both countries had too much to lose. The United States enters the war. But the United States didn't have the kind of army and navy that would be necessary to push the Franco-British and Russian forces over the top and actually have them to defeat Germany. The Americans didn't have that because this was a mostly decentralized, peaceful, civilian-oriented economy. So that had to change. It had to change to create the war economy that we've had ever since, and that process started in 1917. And in order to fund it, there were bonds being sold, and they were called Liberty bonds because, of course, fighting a war means liberty, and so that was the PR stunt that they used to try to name it something pleasant, Well, what Brewer found out was that people in the Treasury Department were colluding to duplicate Liberty bonds. So let's say you buy one of these government bonds at $10. After the bond matures, you take your bond to the government, and then they pay you the $10 back plus the agreed upon interest rate. What was apparently going on, according to Brewer, and we'll never really know the true story because he's dead and all the documents have disappeared and the government denied it all anyway. He found out that people high in the Treasury Department were duplicating bonds. So they sell one to the public, they create a second one, they stick that one in their pocket. Later they'll turn it in. The government will be charged 2 times, and the government will be out some money, but some other people will be getting rich off this. So the government denied these charges, but Brewer had some evidence. He showed it to congressmen and senators. He showed it to the President of the United States, and they all supported him. Now, in the first article that I've got here from 1924, ousted bureau officials will be denied old jobs. President Harding feels no regret over charges and feels the matter's now a closed incident. So is it 23? Yeah, so by 1923, the President of the United States, who is a Republican, and these people would have been mostly Democrats, he's already fired them. They've got other fish to fry. They don't really want to dig into old, closed political issues, even if justice would be served by doing this. It's kind of like how Donald Trump said that he was going to put Hillary Clinton in jail while he was campaigning. That was a big issue. And then after he won, he had to make compromises with a lot of other people in the political ruling class and doing these kind of witch hunt scenarios, even if they're totally just, even if all these people do deserve to go to jail or be executed or whatever it happens to be, they've already been fired. In this case, Hillary Clinton had already lost the election, so the president in both cases is just like, we've got bigger fish to fry. We're not going to worry about this. So justice was not served. Charles Brewer was left out in the cold by the people who would have to have supported him in order to get this stuff done. So it flopped. No good. But Brewer and Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, continued to take each other to court for libel charges until 1927, when Mellon finally prevailed. And so that was the end of it. And no one else heard any more about those bonds. And if you believe Eustace Mullins, then there were a bunch of people in the American New York financial class who did indeed redeem those duplicate bonds and who made millions of dollars off of that at the expense of the American public. So now we're going to talk about this fellow, and that's Andrew Mellon. That's the Secretary of the Treasury at that time. I came across Mellon probably, so that stuff about Brewer was to get us to where we can talk about Mellon, and just to get an idea of what the people in the federal government, in the Secretary of the Treasury, were doing in the aftermath of a war. It wasn't rebuilding the country. It wasn't pumping up the U.S. economy. It was lining their own nest with public money from a war that was supposed to have been fought for truth and justice. Now, we're not talking about mafioso figures. We're talking about the officials of the American government itself. So Mellon was an East Coast banker. He's part of the Anglo-American establishment, and he had a company in his portfolio that was called the Union Guarantee Trust Company. And I didn't know at the time when I was doing research on that organization that it belonged to Mellon, but that's what I found out later when I was looking into this brewer business. So the Union Guarantee Trust Company was a operation that would put out issues and raise money for big financial projects. And one of the financial projects that he funded in about 1920, I would say, was getting the Baku oil fields up and running again for the Soviet Union. We talked in the last episode or last video that I did on this about how the United States was all over the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, and that actually goes back all the way to the beginning of the USSR during this Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War wasn't even over yet, and Mellon was financing an effort to go into the abandoned Tsarist oil fields in Baku in Azerbaijan today and to get those running again. And you might also be interested to know that with Mellon doing the financing, the people who were actually putting together the project was Averell Harriman. Averell Harriman was the leading figure in this family who took up the senior George Bush as like a protege. So the Harriman family ended up creating the Bush family as we know it today. And so Harriman was getting these oil fields up and running in the early 1920s so that the Soviet Union could industrialize itself and have something that they could export. And then Harriman ends up becoming the ambassador to the Soviet Union also, I think in the 1930s. I don't know. Joseph Davies is in there too. I'm not sure of the timeline on that, but if you go look it up, you'll find out. And then I've also got another video in my catalog about the Harriman Institute at Columbia that focuses on Russian and Soviet studies. And we saw what they were up to with the Milosevic trial and the Balkans and Yugoslavia. But anyhow, Mellon's financing that work in the Soviet Union, and he's also defending the Treasury Department from Brewer's probably, at least in my opinion, accurate charges that a bunch of these financial people were getting rich at the expense of the American public. So these are the part of the ruling class of the United States in the teens and 20s. See if I can move on to my next slide here. Okay, we're not going to talk about this guy very long, but this is Edward Mandel House, and he is one of two people who is generally understood to be the handler for Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, I think, was the provost or dean or president or something like that at Columbia University or one of the Ivy League schools. And then he was approached by some people and say, hey, would you like to run for governor of the state of New York? And he was a professor, I think, of political science, but at any rate, he was a philosopher and a political theorist and a professor and academic, not a politician. But he was approached to run for governor of New York. He won. He was then approached to run for president of the United States. He won. Not a political man. And if you're not a politician and you didn't grow up around all that stuff, you really don't know how to do anything. You just don't know. It's like being a military person. You have to be raised in that tradition to be a commander and to be good at it, because there are just so many different aspects of military life that pulling somebody off the street, they're not even going to know where to start. So that's sort of the situation with politics as well, practically speaking. And so Mandel House was one of these two people who was running Woodrow Wilson, I think, by pretty much open admission these days. But we're not going to talk about him too much. We're going to go on to a different guy. You can see Winnie, or oh God, what's his name? I can't believe I'm blanking on one of the greatest criminals of the 20th century. He's responsible for Gallipoli. Winnie. Churchill. Winston Churchill. Winnie. So Winston Churchill is sitting right here next to Bernard Baruch. I've got a video that I'm going to play you, or may play you anyhow. We'll just start talking about it. Bernard Baruch was born in Camden, South Carolina. He was born into a Jewish family. His father's name was Simon Baruch, who was a guy who immigrated to the United States from Prussia in 1860. I don't know if he had any skills or what he was doing, but he was staying with a Jewish merchant family who was also living in Camden, people who were also from Prussia, Ashkenaz Jews. Probably one of the first big wave of Ashkenaz who were coming to the United States. And his father enlisted on the Confederate side during the American Civil War as a doctor, medical officer, even though he had never practiced medicine in his life. But being a doctor, you're off the front line and your pay's better, so I guess it was a good deal for Simon Baruch, if not for the poor, hapless Confederate farm boys that he was operating on, right, without having a clue what he was doing. So bad deal for them, but good deal for Simon. After the war, Simon did even better because he married a girl from a family, the Wolf family, and they were some slave owners and plantation owners in Orangeburg County, South Carolina. And I looked them up in the slave rolls, and you can see them in there. They've got about 52 slaves, as I counted, in 1860. I don't know what happened to them after the war, but before the war, they were rich. You could call them capitalists if you'd like. 50 human beings is certainly a lot of capital. But there would have been, of course, larger slave owners than that. But just remember that before, in about 1860, probably only 3 to 5% of people in the United States owned slaves, and many of those would only own 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slaves. So about half of the slaves in the country were owned by these larger slave owners, people like the Wolf family. So you're talking about the top 1%, basically, of people in the country in terms of their economic position. So Bernard Baruch comes from those two backgrounds. And then he goes to New York City when he's probably about 10 years old. Somehow, not really sure how, gets involved in speculating on the New York Stock Exchange, which I think you had to pay, $10,000 or $20,000 back then at that time just to get onto the New York Stock Exchange as a trader. But he manages to turn that into $1 million or a few $1 million by the early, like 1905 to 1915, somewhere around in there. So he is a financier. He's a financial speculator. He had done some work in a gold mine at one point. So we're really hitting all of I think he was also involved in the liquor trade. Maybe he just speculated in liquor. So gold mines, liquor, financial speculation, slave owning. It's a good background. It's a good American background, right? His mother's family had supposedly been in the United States for a long time. So they probably would have been Sephardic Jews. So it could be the case that Bernard Baruch is the quintessential American Jew, because he could be a fusion of both the Sephardic and the Ashkenaz, and he's got his hands in all these different economic pies. But if that sounds pretty good to you already, like you've moved from podunk South Carolina to New York City and become a millionaire on the stock exchange. If you think that's good, just listen to what is being written about him in 1953 in Morris Rosenblum's Peace Through Strength. And you might have heard that peace through strength catchphrase before, but it's basically the idea that if you spend all of your money on weapons, you won't be induced to use those weapons against anyone, but you will actually achieve peace for everyone. So I believe it was Hesiod who said the sword itself incites to violence. And I know I'm that way. So if I have something in my hand that I could use to hit someone with, you got a stick, you got a machete or something, you might start swinging it because it makes you feel good. I'm that way. But Bernard Baruch disagreed, or at least disagreed publicly. He said it would be peaceful. So let's see what happened to him around World War I. No unelected official in American history before the First World War was ever delegated such immense powers over American resources as Baruch's wartime authority gave him. So let's back up just a little bit and talk about Edward Mandel House. House was the political handler for Woodrow Wilson. Bernard Baruch became the economic handler. And you're not going to be able to wage a war in a country that doesn't have a war economy, so you have to build one. And that was Bernard Baruch's assignment. There's also this question here about, is Bernard Baruch a member of the United States ruling class, or is he someone who's working for the ruling class? Did he become a member of the ruling coalition simply by making $3 million on Wall Street? Or did some force that's really running things grant him $3 million and then put him in charge of a bunch of stuff? I don't know. It's kind of a strange idea. But what happened was that Bernard Baruch gained the power delegated to him through the administration, probably unconstitutionally, through Congress, probably unconstitutionally in many respects there too, to set prices, to create new industries. One of the most outrageous examples that I read about in these newspapers and confirmed through other sources as well was that the United States didn't have enough nitrates or nitrites to manufacture munitions, bombs, shells, bullets, all that stuff, explosives. They didn't have enough of this resource to manufacture it, and most of it came from Peru or somewhere in South America. I think they were still mining guano for all that stuff back then, but they couldn't get enough of it through trade, and they also didn't want to be cut off in case that country should decide not to sell to America anymore. Because, of course, this gigantic market for your goods, they would probably cut us off, right, and starve themselves of all that revenue. This is the kind of ridiculous argument you got. So Bernard Baruch said, well, I'm going to need $100 million to build a plant in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to manufacture this stuff, just in case we get cut off by the Peruvians or whatever. And so the plant turned out to be a gigantic boondoggle. It was built, it operated for like 6 months, and then it shut down and was never used again. And they kind of messed around with it again in the 1930s during the New Deal. They didn't really do anything with it. And then sometime in the 1940s or 50s, it was sold for scrap. So it was just sold at auction. It was never used. And because you waste $100 million of the United States' money at that time, which was an extraordinary amount that most people couldn't comprehend. Think about it in 1918 dollars. He had to testify before, I want to say it was Representative Graham of Illinois or Ohio, in a congressional committee that was called to deal with war expenditures after the First World War. Because, of course, the allegations of fraud, just like with Brewer's accusations about the Treasury Department, all this stuff was rife after the First World War. And Baruch showed up and said, yeah, we built the plant. It was a good idea that we built the plant. That war might have gone on for 10 more years, even though you could look at the war situation in 1916 before the United States entered and know that that wasn't going to happen. And I'm sure as soon as the United States entered, everybody knew the jig was up. So it's a ridiculous assertion, but that's what he said in front of everybody. He said that building the plant was a good idea no matter what, and he stuck by it, and he said, yeah, I did it. So totally lacking any kind of remorse or not showing any weakness at all. Speaking from a position of strength, having wasted $100 million of the public's money, which of course again was money that was taken in through bonds and loans. It wasn't money we had, it was money that was allocated and created for that purpose and then misused. So that I guess we'll stop here for now. That's only the beginning of this issue with Bernard Baruch, though, because he ends up doing the exact same thing in World War II. The other thing I wanted to talk about was I don't know if you've ever heard Benjamin Friedman in his talk about what happened at the Versailles Peace Conference, but two of the guys who were running the American, probably the two guys who were running the American delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference were Mandel House and Bernard Baruch. So if you want to start pointing fingers, not only for the war itself, but the disposition of the war, which then created the interwar period that I think we're going to talk about next time. We're going to talk about Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and Silesia, those hot spots in Central Europe that went a long way towards causing the Second World War. If you want to if you want to parcel out blame for creating that situation, look no further than the American delegation, the American ruling class, and these people like Mandel House and Bernard Baruch. Okay, I think we'll stop there. Thank you for your time.